Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about William Wordsworth's observations in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. The preface to the Lyrical Ballads, 1800, expanded in 1802 and then in 1805. William Wordsworth, 1770-1850. The collection of poems titled Lyrical Ballads was first published in 1798 and the preface was added to the 1800 edition. To the poetry collection, William Wordsworth contributed majority of the poems and Samuel Taylor Coleridge contributed first the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. To the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, appeared in 1800, Wordsworth added the famous preface, which became a manifesto for romantic poetry. So remember, Lyrical Ballads was first published in 1798, and the preface to the Lyrical Ballads appeared in 1800, and the preface was expanded in 1802 and 1805 editions. Purpose of the preface: to explain the poet's theory of poetry and defend the principles behind the poems in a lyrical ballads. Then collaboration. Though the poetry collection is co-authored with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the preface is entirely Wordsworth's composition. Literary significance. The preface is considered the manifesto of English Romanticism, redefining poetic language, themes, and the role of the poet. Inspiration for writing the preface. Reaction against neoclassicism. Wordsworth opposed the artificial, ornate style of 18th century poetry, for example, the poetry of Pope and Dryden. Desire to return to nature and emotion. Influenced by Rousseau's ideals of simplicity and emotional authenticity. Political and social climate. Positive French Revolution ideas of equality, individualism, and a return to natural human instincts. Then Coleridge's influence. Both poets agreed on using simple subjects and a natural speech, though they differed on the supernatural. Aim is to bring poetry closer to the everyday lives of people, away from the elite classical models. Now let's go to the central themes in the preface. Nature and the common man. Poetry should depict rustic life because it is closely aligned with natural emotions and truth. Emotion and imagination. True poetry arises from deep feelings recollected in tranquility. Poetic diction advocates for a language close to real-life speech rather than artificial poetic conventions. The role of the poet. A poet is a man speaking to men with a heightened sensitivity and imagination. Purpose of poetry: to provide pleasure and knowledge by expressing universal truths through imagination and emotion. Spontaneity and reflection. Poetry is not a random emotion, but a refined product of emotion recollected in calm. Unity of form and feeling. Structure must serve the emotional and thematic integrity of the poem. Now let's go to the structure and a section-wise summary of the preface. Definition and a function of poetry. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Emphasizes that poetry must begin with a deep emotion, but it must also be recollected in tranquility for clarity and universality. Purpose of poetry is to give a pleasure, but through moral and emotional insight. Choice of subject. Advocates using incidents and situations from common life as poetic subjects. Rustic life is preferred because people in the countryside live in harmony with nature and thus passions are less restrained. Such a simplicity helps in capturing universal emotions. The use of language. Strong opposition to artificial poetic diction emphasizes the use of a language really used by men, that is, ordinary speech, with the necessary aesthetic modifications. Claims that even rural speech is more expressive and emotionally resonant with the affected language of neoclassical poets. The role and the qualities of a poet. A poet is someone with a greater sensibility, imagination, and understanding than ordinary people. The poet must be emotionally engaged, but also capable of meditative reflection. He should communicate with readers as a human to other humans, not from a pedestal. Process of composition. The emotion that gives rise to poetry must be contemplated calmly, leading to creation through imaginative filtering. Wordsworth defines the composition of poetry as an emotional experience, later meditated upon, then distilled into verse. Meter and a rhyme. Wordsworth defends the use of meter, even though he claims language should be natural. Meter adds pleasure, order, and balance to poetic expression. Meter distinguishes poetry from prose and enhances the aesthetic effect of emotional content. Moral purpose of poetry. Good poetry must also elevate the human spirit. Though the primary aim is pleasure, it should come from morally and spiritually nourishing themes. Now let's analyze the key concepts introduced in the preface. Emotion recollected in tranquility are fundamental to romantic poetic theory. Democratization of poetry. Anyone's life or speech could be poetic. Rejection of poetic ornamentation. Poetry should mirror real life, not imitate classical traditions. Empathy with a common humanity. Elevates the common man as a worthy subject of artistic exploration. Unity of form and emotion. Structure must serve emotional resonance. Now let's analyze the importance and legacy of Wordsworth's preface. Foundation of Romantic aesthetics. It influenced not just English Romantic poets, but the entire European literary scene. Democratized poetry. Made poetry more accessible to the masses by validating everyday life and a language. Revolution in poetic theory. Marked a definitive break from neoclassical rules of imitation, decorum, and formality. Influence on later writers. Inspired Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, Byron, and even modernists who responded to or rebelled against it. Enduring relevance. Contemporary poetry continues to explore emotion, identity, and nature as Wordsworth suggested. Educational institutions still treat it as a foundational document in literary criticism. Now let's analyze the main quotes expressed in the preface. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Wordsworth here defines poetry not as a product of reason but of deep emotion, which is later reflected upon calmly. This process highlights the romantic ideal that emotion, not intellect, lies at the heart of poetic creation. Now the next quote. The principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life. Wordsworth deliberately chose ordinary subjects because they reflect universal truths and raw human emotions. He believed that truth and beauty could be found in the lives of ordinary people rather than in lofty aristocratic themes. The next quote. A man speaking to men. The poet should communicate directly and honestly, not in a high artificial tone. Wordsworth sees the poet as part of humanity, not above it, thereby advocating for accessibility and sincerity. Now the next quote. Law and a rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil. A rustic life is portrayed as pure and emotionally genuine, unattained by social pretense or corruption. This setting allows for the expression of fundamental human emotions in the most authentic form. Now the next quote. The language of these men is adopted because such men hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. Wordsworth believed that the natural speech of rural people was closer to the origins of and beauty of true language. This aligns with his desire to strip poetry of its artificiality and bring it back to natural living expression. Now the next quote. There neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and a metrical composition. Wordsworth blurs the line between poetry and prose, emphasizing that the core of poetry lies in emotion, not structure. He argues that what elevates poetry is its feeling and imagination, not ornamental language. Now the next quote. The feeling therein developed gives importance to the action and situation, and not the action and situation to the feeling. Emotional depth, not dramatic events, should be the focus of poetry. This reverses the neoclassical tradition, which prioritized a plot and a spectacle over internal experience. The next quote. The human mind is capable of being excited without the application of grooves and violent stimulants. Poetry should evoke emotion through subtlety, reflection, and natural scenes rather than sensationalism. Wordsworth critiques the use of exaggerated or shocking content as manipulative and shallow. Now the next quote. The objects of the poet's thoughts are everywhere. Anything in life, no matter how mundane, can inspire poetry. Wordsworth emphasizes that beauty and meaning can be found in the everyday, democratizing the art form. Now the next quote. He has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. The poet is not merely an emotional person, but one deeply attuned to human nature and the universal truths. Wordsworth elevates the poet as a moral and emotional guide for society. Now the next quote. The poet binds together by passion and knowledge the vast empire of human society. The poet serves as a unifier, connecting people through shared emotions and insights. Poetry thus has a communal and almost sacred role in a human experience. Now the next quote. The worth of the poet's work lies in its ability to give a pleasure and elevate the soul. While poetry should be enjoyable, it must also cultivate virtue, insight, and emotional depth. Wordsworth merges aesthetics with ethical and emotional development. Now the next quote. Readers of superior judgment may disapprove, but those who have hearts to be moved will not. Wordsworth anticipates criticism from critics who prioritize form over feeling. He instead appeals to readers who are emotionally receptive and capable of deep empathy. Now the next quote. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Reiterating his central claim, Wordsworth insists that poetry is rooted in raw, genuine emotion. It should not be mechanically constructed, but must arise from the depth of the human spirit. Now moving on to the next quote. The mind of man is naturally the mirror of the fairest and most interesting properties of nature. Human consciousness is in harmony with the beauty and patterns of the natural world. Poetry, therefore, becomes a reflection of both the external world and the inner life. Now the next quote. Poetry is the image of man and nature. This quote captures Wordsworth's belief that poetry should reflect human life and the natural world in harmony. It emphasizes his romantic ideal of the interconnectedness between humanity and nature. Now the next quote. I've attempted to bring my language near to the real language of men. Wordsworth chose plain, natural language for his poetry to make it more relatable and truthful. This was a radical departure from the ornate diction of earlier poetry. Now the next quote. The passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Human emotions are best understood when linked with the entering natural imagery. Nature becomes a stabilizing force that shapes and reflects human feeling. Now the next quote. The interest which the mind attaches to the ideas of the moral sentiments gives them their importance. Wordsworth suggests that morality gains its meaning through emotional investment and a reflection. Poetry, in this sense, becomes a vehicle for both ethical and emotional engagement. Now the next quote. A multitude of causes are now acting with our combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind. Wordsworth criticizes modern society for dulling sensitivity and diminishing people's emotional and intellectual faculties. He sees poetry as a remedy to this problem, helping to awaken deeper perception and feeling.